Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy. I'm Tom, and today we are talking about John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. We are continuing our discussion of ethics and talking about consequentialism. Right, so Mill's view is a consequentialist theory of ethics, and really the term consequentialism is pretty intuitive because an action is deemed right or wrong based on the consequences it produces, right? Notice that this has nothing to do with a person's intentions or character or anything like that, right? um, and the kind of consequences we will be concerned with, at least in Mill's view, you can do it in different ways, but for Mill it has to do with happiness, right? So for him, an action is ethical if it produces more happiness, and it's unethical if it takes away happiness, right? And this is Mill's principle. It's in the reading. It's called the greatest happiness principle, right? Um, the more happiness, the better, and that's pretty much that. That's it in a nutshell. There are some really important qualifications to understand Mill's utilitarianism and consequentialism more generally. Um, the idea behind consequentialism is really the idea that we tend to convey with the term the greater good, right? Doing something for the greater good is a consequentialist concept, right? So let me just back up from that. That's just to kind of give us something to look forward to. Um, Now, if you think about the way Mill's greatest happiness principle gets, presented, you might think, well, if actions are good insofar as they present happiness, then Mill's basically just telling me that I should just pursue pleasure all the time, right? The happier I am, the better, right? And so this is looks a lot like, at least at first glance, like something like hedonism. Now, hedonism is basically a lifestyle of just seeking pleasure, usually immediate physical kind of gratification, right? So hedonism, is a lifestyle that's, very much like sex, drugs, and rock and roll kind of thing, right? Where you just are doing what feels good when you want to do it, right? And in hedonism is also, there's kind of a tradition around this, and that you should not feel guilty about pursuing pleasures like this. But nonetheless, it does not strike one as maybe a particularly promising ethical framework. Um, Now, Mill is not endorsing hedonism, and there's two main reasons for this. Um, the first one is that, like I said, he's concerned with the greatest good, right? It's the greatest happiness principle. He's concerned with pursuing the greater good, and so when he's talking about the greatest happiness, not necessarily like the most happy I've ever been. It's more like the most happiness for everyone, right? So we're concerned with not individual pleasure. We're concerned with like happiness overall, right? So if an action is something that makes me really happy, but it hurts five other people, let's say I steal a bunch of money and then, I don't know, go and, I don't know, do something stupid. And it hurts a bunch of people in the process, but I feel great. I had a great time, right? For Mill, that's not good, right? Because it hurt more people than it helped. Even it made me really happy, it made a lot of other people really miserable, right? So it doesn't kind of weigh out to be promoting the greatest happiness. And conversely, if I do something that makes me a little miserable, but it helps lots of people, right? Some sense of personal sacrifice, then that's also good, right? That's the sense in which we tend to use the greater good, pursuit of the greater good, right? Um, so and the second point here that distinguishes Mill's view from hedonism is the idea of higher and lower pleasures, that he makes this distinction between these two. So for him, lower pleasures are the kinds of things that we typically would associate with like hedonism, where you're, you know, the kind of immediate, what do they call that? Instant gratification you get from food and sex and drugs and all these kinds of things, right? Um, that's lower pleasures for him. Higher pleasures are the kind of satisfaction you get from other things, things that we would kind of think of as a little bit more cultured or just distinctive of human beings, right? So the pleasure you get from doing art, from reading a good book, from helping a person, from achieving something, graduating, or having a child, or all these kinds of things. Those are higher pleasures, right? And so for Mill, he gives a higher value to the higher pleasures. He actually thinks you get more joy out of them than the lower pleasures. Now, that's somewhat contentious, but this is part of what kind of separates him from hedonism. He already values these things that are not kind of hedonistic in their description, right? Okay, so based on all this, Mill's consequentialist view of utilitarianism is that our actions, ethically speaking, ought to be geared towards maximizing utility. And he uses utility in kind of a strange way. Really, consequentialism is a more intuitive term here. But his sense of utility has to do more with like, kind of the return you get from an action, right? Thing has lots of utility if you have a lot of use for it, if you can get a lot out of it, right? And this is the way in which he's thinking about utility, right? He's thinking about the utility of your actions. And this really has to do with, how much benefit are we going to get out of this? So this is a pretty intuitive idea, right? That, oftentimes when we're thinking about what the right thing to do is, we kind of weigh the pros and cons in our head, right? Well, if I do this, then, so and so is going to be upset. And actually, I might, lose this. I might, whatever. But I would get this, or I would have the chance to gain this, or whatever. And you kind of weigh the pros and cons and see how risky it is, or what you think, what you anticipate the consequences would be. And based on that, you kind of decide what the right thing to do is. And Mill thinks that like all of our ethical actions should be framed this way, and he thinks they, by and large, are. This is ethical theory, so he thinks he is articulating our fundamental distinction between right and wrong, right? And the real reasoning behind most moral principles, right? So there's a number of examples to kind of get at this, but one that's really helpful is like the idea of donating to charity, right? So let me back up for one more second. When it comes to utilitarianism, if you've thought this through a little bit in terms of it being like a very accurate theory, and one that's kind of universally accessible to everyone, given some action, you have to weigh the pros and cons in a pretty thorough way if you really want to have a sense of what you really ought to do. And so there's a handout in this unit that's about the utilitarian calculus. If you really want to know the greatest good and whether or not you're promoting the greatest good, then you need to be able to kind of consider all the people who are going to be affected by a given action, think about how their happiness individually is all going to be affected, and then be able to kind of like add it all up at the beginning and at the end and see if you've got an increase of happiness or a decrease, right? And if you have an increase, then it's the right thing. And if you have an overall decrease, then it's the wrong thing, right? And it always has to do with the overall increase or decrease, right? So For Mill, something like charity is obviously a very good thing to do. Typically, someone who donates to charity already has a good amount of money, right? Or enough to support themselves and not really want for much. So if you are a millionaire and you want to donate, $20,000 to some charity, that might really help a number of people, and it's not really going to take anything away from your own happiness. Um, and so that would be a clear example of where, consequentialism kind of endorses that kind of view. Um, Now, but the more controversial versions of this are, think about something like, self-sacrifice. If you're, I don't know, in a war or something, and the rest of your troop could like escape a area where you're pinned down, but one of you would have to like run out and distract the enemy, and you're gonna die. Um, for Mill, but it's going to save, say, 15 other people. For Mill's going to say, yeah, that's the right thing to do, right? If you sacrifice one for the good of the many, that's a consequentialist view. And so that's where it gets a little more dicey. But also, with Mill's utilitarianism, he will, give us some good reason to reject some kind of hard line and fast principles that you might see in something like Kantian ethics, right? So for Kant, if we recall, stealing is never okay, right? It's a categorical imperative. That means it gives a demand categorically, like in the sense we say it's categorically false, right? Like absolutely. Um, But for Mill, I mean, so you think about that for a second, you think, well, there might be times where it's okay to steal. Like, say, if you stole some food to feed someone who's starving because they didn't have any money, it seems like the right thing to do in that case. And the person you're stealing from maybe won't even notice it's gone. And so, what's the harm? And Mill's going to say there is no harm. And in fact, it just increases the overall greatest good. The person you're stealing from doesn't really get impacted. The person you're stealing for is really helped. And even if you're stealing for yourself, that's okay. Everyone's just kind of like a cog in this whole overall calculus, right? And so, if it promotes the overall greatest good, it's good. And that's it, right? So that's part of the appeal to Mill's utilitarianism and consequentialism. Um, but the main thing to note here is that it's all based on the consequences, right? The consequences and to what extent it affects the greater good, right? If it takes away from the greater good, the overall happiness of everyone involved, then it's the wrong thing to do. If it increases the overall happiness even a little bit, it's the right thing to do. Um, so yeah, that's it for today, and I will be talking with you soon.